When Keanu Reeves wiped Sandra Bullock's tears, the internet couldn't stop talking. It began on a rainy afternoon in Los Angeles, the kind of day when even the most crowded streets feel strangely empty. Keanu Reeves had always loved the rain. It reminded him that life, no matter how unpredictable or painful, always had a way of cleansing itself. He was walking quietly through the hospital corridor, the soft hum of machines and distant whispers echoing around him, when his phone buzzed with a message that would change everything. Sandra is here. She's crying. Keanu stopped in his tracks. He stared at the screen as if the words might rearrange themselves into something easier to face. Sandra Bullock, the woman who had once been his closest friend, his confidant, his almost, was just a few doors away. They hadn't spoken properly in nearly 2 years. Too many unspoken words, too many missed chances. Yet here she was, breaking down in a place that already smelled like heartbreak. He didn't know what he would say, but he knew he had to go. The door to the small waiting room creaked as he pushed it open, and there she was, sitting alone by the window, her hair falling over her face, her shoulders shaking with every quiet sob. Time seemed to pause in that moment. She looked nothing like the glamorous actress the world knew. She looked like a woman who had been carrying the weight of too many silent battles. Sandra. His voice was softer than he intended. She turned her head slowly, and when their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them, a memory, a promise, a wound. She wiped at her face quickly, embarrassed to be seen so fragile. Keanu, I didn't think you'd come. You texted. I came. It was simple. It was honest. And somehow, that was enough. For a long time, they just sat there in silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of everything they never said. Finally, Sandra broke it. It's my mom, she whispered, her voice trembling. The doctors say it's spreading faster than they thought. I thought I was prepared for this, but I'm not. Her words hit him like a blow to the chest. He had known her mother was sick, but he hadn't known how bad it had gotten. And now, watching her break apart, he felt something deep and familiar, that urge to fix what couldn't be fixed. He moved closer, reaching out with careful hands. When his fingers brushed against her cheek, she flinched at first, out of surprise more than anything, and then melted into the touch. Keanu wiped away her tears slowly, gently, as if they were the most precious thing he'd ever held. You don't have to be strong right now, he said quietly. Not with me. That was all it took. She leaned into him, her body trembling as years of bottled up emotion poured out in messy, uncontrollable sobs, and he just held her. No grand speeches, no promises he couldn't keep. Just the warmth of his arms and the steady heartbeat beneath her ear. To the world, Keanu Reeves was the man who moved through life with unshakable calm, the hero on screen, the mystery of it. But here, in this small room, with rain streaking the window and the woman he once loved breaking in his arms, he was just a man who cared deeply and loved quietly. Do you remember? She said after a long while, her voice still thick with tears, that night after the premiere of Speed, when everything was too loud, too much, and you just sat with me on the hotel balcony for hours? You didn't say a word. You just listened. I remember, he said softly. You told me silence was the safest place you'd ever been. She let out a shaky laugh, half sobbing, half smiling. You're still that safe place, aren't you? If you want me to be. What neither of them said, but both knew, was that their story had never really ended. Life had pulled them in different directions. Careers had consumed them. Relationships had come and gone. But the bond they shared had always remained, quietly pulsing beneath the surface, waiting for a moment like this to rise again. And yet, there was something different this time. The air felt heavier, the emotions deeper. Maybe it was the years they had lost. Maybe it was the fear of losing more. Or maybe it was the simple truth that they had always belonged in each other's corners. No matter how far apart they drifted. I don't know what I'm going to do if she... Sandra's voice cracked before she could finish. You'll do what you've always done. Keanu said gently. You'll love her with everything you have. You'll make every moment count. And when the time comes, you'll keep living, because that's what she would want. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't even enough. But it was the truth. And sometimes, the truth was the only thing that could keep someone standing. As the rain softened outside and the sterile white walls of the hospital seemed a little less cold, Sandra leaned her head against his shoulder. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For coming. For staying. For being you. He smiled, a small, quiet smile that reached his tired eyes. There's nowhere else I'd rather be, and in that moment, that simple, fragile moment, the rest of the world faded away. What neither of them knew was that this was just the beginning. The days ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. There would be more tears, more choices, more painful truths, and buried beneath all of it would be a secret, one that had been waiting for years to reveal itself, a secret that could either bring them closer than ever, or tear them apart forever. But for now, in the soft glow of a rainy afternoon, Keanu Reeves held Sandra Bullock close and wiped away her tears as if they were his own. And somewhere deep inside, a story that the internet would one day never stop talking about quietly began. Asterisk the next morning. The world outside the hospital carried on as usual. Cars hummed through wet streets. People hurried to work, and headlines changed by the minute. But inside room 214, time seemed to stand still. Sandra's mother was still asleep, her breathing shallow but steady, and Sandra sat beside her bed with eyes that had forgotten how to rest. Keanu walked in quietly, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He had barely slept, his thoughts circling around her all night. He didn't know why he felt so deeply about this. Maybe because he had lost so much himself, or maybe because a part of him had always believed that protecting Sandra was something he was meant to do. "You're here early," she murmured, taking the cup from him. "I never left," he admitted. "I stayed downstairs in the lobby." She looked up at him, surprised. "Keanu, you didn't have to." "I know," he said, cutting her off gently. "But I wanted to." There was something unspoken in his words, a promise that he wasn't going anywhere. Not this time. As the hours passed, Sandra found herself leaning on him in ways she hadn't allowed herself to before. He handled the endless calls from doctors, brought her meals she barely touched, and even sat with her mother when Sandra needed a moment to breathe. And though he said little, his presence spoke volumes. Late that afternoon, as the rain finally gave way to a pale, golden sunlight, Sandra asked the question that had been lingering on her mind. "Why are you really here, Keanu?" He didn't answer right away. He stared out the window, watching the clouds part over the city skyline. "Because I know what it's like," he said finally, "to lose someone, to feel like the ground's been pulled out from under you. And I also know how much it matters to have someone there when it happens." She swallowed hard. "You're talking about Jennifer, aren't you?" His breath hitched at the mention of her name, the woman he had loved and lost, the wound that never fully healed. "Yeah," he whispered. "I thought I was strong. But when she was gone, I realized strength isn't about pretending you're okay. It's about having someone beside you who doesn't let you fall apart alone." Sandra's eyes softened. "And you think I need that?" "I think we all do." The next few days blurred into one another. Hospital rooms turned into second homes. Exhaustion turned into a constant companion. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Keanu and Sandra began to rediscover the bond they had once shared. Not the glamorous one seen on red carpets, but the quiet, deeply human one built on late-night talks, shared silences, and the small, steady ways they showed up for each other. But just as everything started to feel bearable again, life, as it often does, threw them a curveball they never saw coming. On the 5th day, Sandra's mother took a sudden turn for the worse. Machines beeped louder, doctors spoke faster, and panic filled the room like oxygen. Sandra clung to her mother's hand, whispering prayers and promises between sobs. And Keanu, he stood by the door, helpless, watching the woman he cared for most in the world break into pieces. Hours later, when the storm finally passed and her mother was stable again, Sandra stumbled out into the hallway, her legs barely holding her up. Keanu caught her before she fell, his arms wrapping around her like an anchor. "I can't do this," she choked. "I'm not strong enough." "Yes, you are," he said firmly, looking into her tear-streaked face. "You're stronger than you think. And when you're not, I'll be here, every step of the way." She stared at him, really stared, as if seeing him for the first time. And in that gaze, something shifted. It was subtle, quiet, but real. The kind of shift that happens when friendship begins to blur into something deeper. That night, long after visiting hours had ended, they sat together on a bench outside the hospital. The city lights flickered in the distance, and the air was heavy with the smell of rain-soaked earth. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we tried?" Sandra asked suddenly. Keanu glanced at her, surprised. "Tried what?" "Us." The word hung between them like a confession. He took a slow breath before answering. "I think about it more than I should," he admitted. But timing was never on our side. We were always chasing something: careers, relationships, expectations. Maybe we were too afraid to see what was right in front of us. And now, she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He hesitated. Now, I don't know. Maybe it's too late. She turned to him, her eyes searching his. Or maybe it's not. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched thin, charged with possibility. Then she leaned her head against his shoulder, just like she had so many years ago on that hotel balcony, and he let out a breath. He hadn't realized he was holding Dot, but as comforting as that moment was, the universe wasn't done testing them. 2 days later, while Keanu was out grabbing lunch, Sandra received a call that froze her blood. It wasn't from the hospital. It was from a lawyer, Ms. Bullock. The voice said, calm and professional. We need to speak regarding your late father's estate. There are documents here suggesting a legal conflict that may affect your mother's care and your financial responsibilities. Sandra's heart sank. She had always known her father's affairs were complicated, but she never imagined they could come back to haunt her now. When she was already at her breaking point, when Keanu returned, he found her pacing the hallway, her hands trembling. What's wrong? He asked immediately. It's my father, she whispered. There's something they didn't tell me. Something about money, about the house. If this goes badly, I could lose everything, including the ability to pay for Mom's treatment. Keanu's expression hardened, his protective instincts kicking in. Then we'll fix it. Whatever it is, we'll handle it together. Together? She echoed, her voice small. I told you, he said. I'm not going anywhere. What neither of them realized was that this legal mess would soon uncover something far more explosive than unpaid bills or inheritance disputes. Buried deep in her father's records was a name, one Keanu knew all too well. A name that connected their families in a way that neither of them could have predicted. And when the truth came out, it wouldn't just test their bond, it would threaten to destroy it. But for now, all they could do was hold on to each other, two souls finding their way back together in a world that seemed determined to tear them apart. And in that fragile, uncertain space, love, real, unspoken, and perfect love, began to take root. The days after the lawyer's call felt like living in a storm without an umbrella. Sandra tried to focus on her mother's recovery, but her mind was a battlefield of fear and unanswered questions. She barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her father's face, the man who had always been her rock, now a ghost with secrets buried deep in dusty legal files. Keanu noticed the change in her immediately. The sparkle that had once lived behind her eyes was gone. She smiled less, spoke less, and spent hours staring out the hospital window as if trying to see the future before it arrived. Talk to me, he said gently one night as they sat on the bench outside, the city humming softly around them. I can't, she whispered. Not until I know everything. Then let me help you find out. She hesitated, torn between pride and desperation. But deep down, she knew she couldn't do this alone. So she nodded, and together they decided to meet the lawyer the next morning. The law office was cold and impersonal, a place where feelings didn't matter and only facts could change lives. Sandra sat stiffly in the leather chair as the lawyer slid a thick folder across the table. These are the documents your father signed shortly before his passing, he explained. Most of it concerns property transfers and outstanding debts. But there's one file in particular that complicates things. Sandra flipped through the pages, her hands trembling. And then she saw it, a name written in bold letters on a contract dated almost 30 years ago. Eleanor Reeves. Her heart stopped. She turned slowly to Keanu, whose face had gone pale. That's my mother, he said quietly. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. What does this mean? Sandra asked, her voice shaking. The lawyer cleared his throat. It appears your father and Mrs. Reeves co-owned a property together, one that was never legally dissolved after she passed. The proceeds from its sale were meant to go into a shared trust, but the trust was never closed. There's also a personal letter here, addressed to both families. Sandra stared at the sealed envelope as if it were a ticking bomb. With trembling fingers, she opened it. To my dear Sandra and Keanu, the letter began. If you're reading this, then I am gone, and the truth must now belong to you. Our families share more than friendship. We share a promise, one made long ago when your mother and I decided to protect each other's children, no matter what life threw our way. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She couldn't finish reading. Why didn't he tell me? She whispered. Why didn't mine? Keanu muttered, his voice thick with emotion. The revelation shattered something in both of them. It wasn't betrayal, exactly. It was deeper than that. It was the weight of a past they never knew existed, a bond formed long before they ever met. And now, it was pulling them into a story they had never agreed to be part of. So what happens now? Sandra asked. You have a legal right to part of the trust, the lawyer explained. But so does Mr. Reeves. If either of you contest it, this could drag on for years. And unfortunately, the funds are tied to the property sale, which means they could be frozen until the matter is resolved. Frozen, Sandra repeated, her voice trembling. But I need that money for my mother's treatment. The lawyer nodded grimly. I'm sorry. Unless both parties sign a joint agreement, there's nothing we can do. When they stepped out of the office, the sun was bright and cruel. Sandra could barely breathe. This is my fault, she whispered. If it weren't for me, none of this. Don't. Keanu interrupted firmly. This isn't your fault. This is something our parents did. We're just the ones cleaning up the mess. But now you're part of it, she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. And I hate that. He reached out and wiped her tears away, just like he had that first day. I told you, I'm not leaving. Not even for this. But fate, as always, had other plans out later that week. Keanu received a call of his own, one that would complicate everything even more. It was from a man named Daniel Harrow, a former business partner of his late mother, Mr. Reeves. The voice said, calm but urgent. You should know there's more to that trust than the lawyers are telling you. Elena and Mr. Bullock didn't just buy property together. They funded something bigger. Keanu's brow furrowed. What do you mean? A research foundation, a medical project, and if what I've heard is true, the patents tied to it are worth millions, but only if both heirs agree to release them. Keanu's mind spun. He had expected a legal battle, maybe some family secrets, but this, a hidden project worth millions, buried under decades of silence? It changed everything. And if Sandra found out, it could change how she saw him too. That night, he didn't go to the hospital. He needed space to think. But Sandra noticed his absence, and with every hour that passed, doubt began to creep in. What if he changes his mind? What if he wants the money? What if everything he's done for me was never real? By midnight, her thoughts had turned to fear. And by morning, fear had turned into anger. When Keanu finally showed up, she was waiting by the entrance, arms crossed, eyes red. Where were you? She demanded. I needed time. He said quietly, time for what? To decide how much of the trust you want. The words cut deeper than she intended, and regret flashed across her face the moment they left her lips. But Keanu didn't flinch. He just nodded slowly. I get it, he said softly. You're scared, but don't ever think this is about money for me. It's about you. It's always been about you. Her anger melted into guilt. I'm sorry, she whispered. I don't know who to trust anymore. Then trust me, he said, stepping closer. Trust that I'd burn every dollar before I let it come between us. His words should have been enough. They almost were. But the universe had one more twist to throw their way. 2 days later, Sandra received a sealed package in the mail. No return address, no note. Inside was a set of photographs. Old photographs. Her father, Keanu's mother, together, not just as business partners, but as lovers. The ground beneath her feet vanished. And in that moment, a terrifying thought formed in her mind, one that threatened to destroy everything they were building. What if their story was never meant to be a love story at all? What if it was a mistake from the very beginning? The truth was finally crawling out of the shadows, but neither of them was ready for what it would reveal, and when it did, the world and their hearts would never be the same again. The photographs lay scattered across the hospital floor like shattered pieces of a life. She thought she understood. Sandra stared at them, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. Her father's arm around Eleanor Reeves. Late-night dinners. Stolen glances. A handwritten note on the back of one picture that read, for the future we couldn't have. She felt sick, betrayed, lost. Keanu walked into the room moments later, carrying coffee and a bag of breakfast he'd picked up on the way. But the moment he saw her pale face and the trembling photographs at her feet, his smile faded. What's that? He asked, his voice low and cautious. She didn't answer. Instead, she held up one of the photos with shaking hands. Were you ever going to tell me? Keanu froze. Tell you what? That our parents were lovers. She shouted, the words tearing out of her like a wound that had finally burst silence. A silence so heavy it seemed to crush the air around them. I didn't know, he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. I swear, Sandra, I didn't know. Don't lie to me, she whispered, please. Don't lie to me. I'm not, he said, stepping closer. I knew they were close. I knew they had some kind of promise. But I didn't know this. Not like this. But Sandra couldn't hear him. Not really. Her mind was spinning, pulling her back into every moment they'd shared. Every comforting word, every gentle touch, every quiet promise. And now, all of it felt poisoned by the possibility that their bond had been built on a lie. What if we're... She started, but the words caught in her throat. What if this isn't right? What if we're a mistake? Keanu's face broke, his heart splintering at the sight of her falling apart. He closed the distance between them and gently took her hands, grounding her shaking body with his steady warmth. Listen to me, he said firmly. Whatever they did, whoever they were, that's their story, not ours. We are not a mistake. But she pulled her hands away, tears streaming down her cheeks. How can you be so sure? They lied to us, Keanu, about everything, about the trust, about their past, maybe about us too, because I know what's real, he said, his voice breaking. And this, you and me, is the most real thing I've ever felt. She stared at him, torn between the urge to believe and the instinct to run. But fear won. I need space, she whispered, backing away. I need to think. And before he could stop her, she was gone. For days, Keanu didn't hear from her. She stopped answering calls, ignored his messages, and even avoided the hospital cafeteria where they used to sit together every evening. It felt like he had lost her, not just as a friend or as someone he cared for, but as the heartbeat that had quietly started to guide his days. He spent those days walking the city, thinking about everything they had been through, the tears, the laughter, the late-night talks, the near confessions, and every memory pointed to one truth. He loved her, deeply, painfully, completely. He wasn't ready to let her go. On the fourth day, he made a decision. He walked into the law office again and demanded access to every document, every letter, every scrap of paper related to their parents. He spent hours reading through dusty contracts and faded notes until he found something buried in the back of a file, a letter neither of them had seen before. It was from Reeves, and it changed everything. To Keanu and Sandra, if this letter ever reaches you, it means the past has finally caught up. Yes, your father and I loved each other once, deeply, but that love ended long before either of you were born. We made a choice, not to build a life together, but to protect the ones we already had. That promise was never about us. It was about you, about making sure you would both grow up knowing kindness, loyalty, and the strength to build something better than what we had. If you ever doubt your place in each other's lives, remember this. Nothing we did was meant to bind you. It was meant to free you. Keanu read those words over and over, his chest tightening with every line. This wasn't a story of forbidden love casting a shadow over their lives. It was a story of the broken people trying to give their children the chance to write a new one. And he knew, no matter how afraid Sandra was, she needed to hear that dot when he finally found her. She was sitting on the hospital roof under a pale evening sky. Her mother had been moved to a private room and was stable for now, but the weight of everything else still pressed down on her shoulders. I thought you might come, she said quietly without looking up. I had to, he replied, holding the letter out to her. You need to read this. She hesitated, then took it. As her eyes scanned the words, her breath hitched. She read it again, and then a third time, as if trying to believe it was real. They wanted us to have a chance. She whispered double quotes yes, Keanu said softly. They did. For the first time in days, their eyes met, and this time, there was no anger, no accusation, only the people standing at the edge of something fragile and real, terrified to break it but too drawn to walk away. I was so scared, Sandra admitted, her voice trembling. Scared that everything we are was built on lies. Scared that maybe we weren't meant to be. Maybe we're not meant to be. He said gently, maybe we're meant to choose to be, and that's a lot stronger. She laughed through her tears, a small, broken sound that carried more relief than joy. You really believe that? With everything I am. There was a long pause. Then, slowly, she reached out and took his hand. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a promise. But it was enough and in that quiet, trembling moment, something inside both of them shifted. The walls they had built, out of fear, grief, guilt, began to crack, and through those cracks, something brighter began to grow. But just as it seemed they might finally find peace, life, as it always did, had one more twist waiting. A week later, a journalist contacted Sandra with a warning. Someone is leaking information about your father's connection to the Reeves family. The voice said, it's not just about the trust. It's about the foundation, about millions of dollars. It could destroy both your careers. The past wasn't done with them yet, and this time, it wasn't just their hearts on the line. It was their names, their legacies, their futures. The call from the journalist hit Sandra like a thunderbolt. She stood frozen in the hospital corridor, phone pressed against her ear. As the words echoed over and over, it could destroy both your careers. The scandal wasn't just about inheritance now. It wasn't just about their parents' past. It was about something much darker, a story that someone, somewhere, was preparing to twist into a headline. And in Hollywood, headlines had power. They could build you up. They could tear you apart. That night, Sandra sat alone in her apartment, lights off, phone buzzing endlessly with unanswered messages. Keanu called. He texted. He even came by the hospital, but she had already left. She needed space, not just from the world, but from him, because no matter how much she wanted to believe in them, she knew that once the story broke, everything would change, and she wasn't sure if love could survive the weight of public judgment. The following morning, the headline exploded across every major entertainment site. Secret family pact exposed, Bullock and Reeves tied by decades-old affair, and millions in hidden assets. By noon, paparazzi had swarmed the hospital. By afternoon, talk shows and gossip blogs were spinning theories. Were they lovers? Were they secretly related? Was their entire friendship a publicity stunt? Keanu and Sandra went from private pain to public spectacle overnight. He found her hiding in a small cafe downtown, disguised under a baseball cap and sunglasses. Even then, cameras flashed outside. We need to talk, he said gently as he sat across from her. About what? She whispered, her voice hollow. About how my entire life is now a headline, or how people are calling us disgusting for something we didn't even know existed. About us, he said simply. She looked away. There's no us anymore. Don't say that, he pleaded. Not after everything, Keanu, she said, her voice breaking. This isn't about love anymore. It's about survival. My mom's still in the hospital. My career is hanging by a thread. And now, because of all this, I can't even walk down the street without people shouting things at me. I can't do this. He reached across the table, but she pulled her hand back before he could touch it. Please, he whispered, his voice trembling. Don't push me away. I have to, she said, tears falling silently down her cheeks. For both of us. He watched her walk out of the cafe and into a storm of flashing cameras and shouted questions. And for the first time since all this began, Keanu felt truly powerless. He had built a career on being calm, grounded, unshakable. But this, losing her, watching her crumble under the weight of public scrutiny, was a pain he didn't know how to fix. Days turned into weeks. Sandra stopped returning calls. Their lawyers handled the trust dispute quietly behind closed doors. Public interest slowly shifted to new scandals, but the distance between them only grew. Yet even with all the silence, neither of them could stop thinking about the other. She would catch herself rereading old text messages. He would find himself watching interviews where she laughed just to hear her voice. They were still connected, not by circumstance, not by their parents' choices, but by something deeper they couldn't switch off. One evening, nearly a month later, Keanu received a call that shattered the quiet. It's her mother, the nurse said urgently. She's taken a turn for the worse. She's asking for you both. Within minutes, he was racing to the hospital. Sandra was already there, sitting beside her mother's bed with red-rimmed eyes. She looked exhausted, not just physically, but in a way that went deeper, as if the last pieces of her strength had finally given out. When she saw him, she didn't speak. She didn't have to. She simply reached for his hand, and he took it without hesitation. For hours, they sat there together, holding vigil over the woman who had raised Sandra with grace and grit. And in that quiet, grief-filled space, something shifted between them once again. I thought I could do this alone, she whispered. You were never meant to, he replied softly. She turned to him, tears spilling down her cheeks. I was so scared. Not just of the headlines or the lies, but of losing you, of ruining you. You could never ruin me, he said, his voice breaking. You're the only thing that's ever made me feel whole. Hours later, as dawn crept through the hospital window, Sandra's mother woke for the first time in days. She was weak, her voice barely a whisper, but her eyes were bright and full of knowing. You're here, she said softly to Sandra. And so is he. I'm here, Mom, Sandra whispered. Her mother smiled faintly. I always hoped you two would find each other. The words hung in the air like a blessing or a prophecy, and as her mother drifted back into sleep, Sandra felt something inside her heart begin to heal. She looked at Keanu and, for the first time in weeks, didn't see chaos or scandal or fear. She saw the man who had held her together when she was falling apart, the man who had stayed when everyone else had walked away. I'm sorry, she whispered. For what? For pushing you away, for not trusting us. He smiled softly. You never lost me, but just as the universe had given them a moment of peace, it prepared to snatch it away again. 2 days later, Sandra received a letter from the legal board, a warning that if the trust wasn't resolved soon, the government could seize the assets for tax violations. And if that happened, her mother's treatment and Keanu's stake in the foundation would both collapse. They had one chance to fix everything. Sign the joint agreement. But there was a catch. Doing so would mean going public, standing side by side in front of the press and acknowledging everything. The affair, the trust, the foundation, their connection. It was the only way to save everything, and it meant putting their reputations and their hearts on the line once more. Are you sure about this? Keanu asked the night before the press conference. No, Sandra admitted, but I know I don't want to keep hiding. Not from them, not from the world, not from you. He took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. Then whatever happens, we do it together. She nodded. Together. And for the first time in months, the future didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a choice, one they were finally ready to make. But the world was not ready for what was coming, because the press conference that was supposed to save them was about to uncover one final, devastating truth, one that would change everything they thought they knew about their past and their future. The morning of the press conference arrived with a strange, heavy silence. Los Angeles skies were clouded, as if even the weather was holding its breath. Cameras were already lined up outside the hotel ballroom hours before the event. Reporters jostled for position. Producers rehearsed their lines. And inside a small dressing room, Sandra stared at her reflection in the mirror, trying to steady the storm inside her chest. Are you ready? Keanu's voice was soft as he stepped into the room. No, she whispered honestly, but I'm doing it anyway. He smiled faintly. That's courage. She turned to him, searching his eyes. Whatever happens out there, I want you to know that I don't regret any of it. Not one moment. Me neither, he said. Not 1 second. He reached for her hand and held it tightly, as if reminding her that no matter how loud the world became, they were stronger together. And in that quiet, shared moment, the fear didn't disappear, but it finally stopped controlling them. The ballroom was packed. Flashes from cameras turned the air into a strobe of white light. Questions were shouted before they even reached the podium. But Sandra and Keanu stood side by side, fingers brushing, but never fully parting. A united front in the storm. Thank you for being here, Sandra began, her voice trembling slightly, but growing steadier with each word. Today isn't about scandal. It's about truth, a truth that was hidden from us, but one we now choose to face openly. She explained everything. The trust, the property, their parents' complicated past. She spoke of love, betrayal, and forgiveness, not just theirs, but the generations before them. Keanu spoke next, his words calm and grounded, weaving vulnerability with strength. This isn't a story about shame, he said. It's a story about how the people can rise above the past and write a future on their own terms. The crowd was silent. For the first time since the scandal broke, the narrative shifted. They weren't tabloid characters anymore. They were the human beings, bruised but unbroken. And then, just as the conference was wrapping up, a reporter stood and asked the question neither of them expected. Mr. Reeves, Ms. Bullock, are you in love? The room held its breath. Sandra's eyes flickered toward Keanu, his toward hers. Yes, he said, without hesitation. It was the truth. Raw, simple, undeniable. The crowd erupted. Questions flew, but none of it mattered, because in that moment, The world finally knew what they had known all along, that their story wasn't about scandal or inheritance. It was about love. But just as the dust began to settle, one more truth waited to surface, one that would shake everything they thought they knew. 2 weeks after the conference, they received a call from the Foundation's board of directors. The trust had finally been unlocked, and as part of the legal process, additional sealed documents had been released. Among them was a final letter, one from Sandra's father, written shortly before his death. It was addressed to them both, "My dear Sandra and Keanu, by now you know everything, or almost everything. But there is one more truth you deserve to hear. Elena and I were not just partners in business. We were partners in vision. The foundation we started wasn't just about research. It was about building something that could outlive us, something the two of you could continue together. We built it for you. And if there's one thing I regret, it's that we let fear and pride keep us from telling you how much we believed in you, and in the bond you would one day share. I don't know if it will be friendship, or love, or something in between, but I do know this: you were always meant to find each other, and when you did, the world would be better for it." Sandra's hands trembled as she finished reading. Keanu placed his hand over hers, his heart swelling with a strange, quiet peace. "They believed in us," she whispered. "They always did," he said softly. Life slowly began to rebuild itself after that. The press frenzy faded. The headlines moved on. The Foundation's work resumed stronger than ever, this time with Sandra and Keanu at the helm, side by side, just as their parents had once dreamed. But the biggest change wasn't in the public eye. It was in the small, ordinary moments, cooking breakfast together on Sunday mornings, walking through the city without disguises, holding hands without fear of who might see. One evening, months later, they visited the old property their parents had once shared, now a part of the Foundation's headquarters. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Keanu turned to her with that familiar, gentle smile. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" he asked. "All the time," she said. "And every time, it still surprises me." "Me too," he admitted. "But you know what surprises me the most?" "What?" "That through everything, the pain, the lies, the chaos, I never once stopped loving you." She smiled, tears shining in her eyes. "And I never stopped needing you." He brushed a tear from her cheek, the same way he had on that rainy afternoon months ago, and this time, she didn't cry from grief. She cried from gratitude, from love, from the quiet, beautiful knowledge that after everything, they had found their way home. The internet would never stop talking about the day Keanu Reeves wiped Sandra Bullock's tears. But for them, that day was never about headlines. It was the day everything truly began. A story born from tragedy and secrets had become one of healing and hope. And as they walked hand in hand into the future, they knew their past didn't define them, they defined each other. And that, more than any scandal, any headline, or any legacy, was the love story the world would remember forever.